Late September carries a particular kind of light in Cedar Falls, Iowa, golden and slanted, painting the sidewalks amber as children spill from doorways with backpacks bouncing against their spines. On the morning of September 27, 1999, dew clung to the grass in crystalline beads, and 8-year-old Mara Hollis sat on her front porch tying the laces of her red canvas sneakers. They were new, bought 3 days earlier at the outlet mall, and she had insisted on wearing them every day since. The rubber soles squeaked against the concrete as she hopped down the steps, her mother's voice trailing behind her with the usual reminders about looking both ways and staying with her friend Emma until the bus came. The sky overhead stretched pale blue with streaks of grey gathering at the horizon, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and wood smoke from a neighbour's chimney. Mara waved without turning around, her ponytail swinging as she ran toward the corner where Emma waited beneath the oak tree, whose leaves were just beginning to turn copper at the edges. The red shoes flashed bright against the pavement, their laces double-knotted the way her father had taught her, tight enough to stay secure through a full day of running and playing. The morning unfolded in ordinary rhythms. Mrs. Jen watered her roses across the street, droplets catching the sunlight like tiny prisms. Mr. Kowalski reversed his pickup truck from his driveway with careful precision, honking twice at Mara as he always did, a ritual that made her giggle every single time. The two girls drew hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with pink chalk Emma had brought from home, their laughter bright and unguarded, the kind of sound that belongs only to childhood mornings when the whole day stretches ahead full of possibility. At 8:15, the yellow bus rounded the corner with its familiar hydraulic sigh, and both girls climbed aboard, Mara taking her usual seat 3 rows from the front beside the window where she could watch the houses slide past. The driver, a woman named Linda with reading glasses on a beaded chain, marked her attendance sheet with a practiced check mark. Everything proceeded as it always had. Mathematics worksheets where Mara struggled with long division, a spelling quiz where she earned a perfect score, lunch in the cafeteria where she traded her apple slices for Emma's granola bar. The school day closed at 3:05 with the bell's electric buzz, and children flooded the hallways toward buses and carpool lanes, their voices echoing off lockers and tile floors. Mara was supposed to meet her mother at the East Entrance bus stop at 3:10. Her mother, Claire Hollis, had arranged to leave work early that day for a dentist appointment Mara had been nervous about all week, worrying about cavities and the possibility of a filling. Claire arrived at 3:07, parking her sedan in the designated pickup zone and scanning the cluster of children streaming through the double doors. She waited, engine idling, watching other families reunite and depart in the familiar choreography of school dismissal. By 3:20, the crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers lingering near the entrance. By 3:30, Claire's hands were tight on the steering wheel, her breath coming shallow, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She stepped out of the car and approached the entrance, asking a teacher's aide if she had seen Mara. The aide checked the dismissal logs. Mara had been marked present for the final class period, but had not boarded any bus and had not been signed out through the office. A quick sweep of the building revealed empty classrooms and locked bathrooms, the hallways eerily quiet after the chaos of dismissal. At 3:42, Claire called her husband Daniel from the school office, her voice fractured and barely holding together. At 3:50, the school principal contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department, initiating protocols that everyone hoped would never be necessary. If you're drawn to stories where ordinary days fracture into years of searching, where hope becomes a discipline, practiced in silence through decades of uncertainty, subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These cases ripple across borders and time zones, connecting us all in our shared need for answers and resolution. Within an hour, patrol units canvassed the school perimeter and surrounding blocks in widening circles. Officers interviewed teachers, custodians, cafeteria workers, and the bus driver, reconstructing Mara's last confirmed moments with meticulous attention to detail. A classmate recalled seeing her near the bike racks talking to someone, though the description was vague and uncertain. A figure in a dark jacket, possibly male, possibly alone, or maybe with someone else. The school's aging surveillance system offered grainy footage of hallways and exits, timestamps blurry and frames skipping. But the east entrance camera had malfunctioned that morning, recording only static and occasional flickers of distorted image. By evening, search parties formed organically, neighbors emerging from homes with flashlights and thermoses of coffee, the community mobilizing with the speed that comes from collective fear. Volunteers divided into grids, combing ditches, checking behind dumpsters, peering into drainage culverts, calling Mara's name into the gathering darkness. Bloodhounds arrived from a neighboring county just after sunset, following a scent trail that led to the edge of the school parking lot and then dissipated near the street, suggesting a vehicle had been involved. The local news ran Mara's school photo during the 6 o'clock broadcast, a gap-toothed smile, brown eyes bright with mischief, wearing a yellow sweater. Tips began flooding the police hotline immediately, each one logged and investigated, most leading nowhere but consuming precious resources and time. The Hollis home became command central within 48 hours. Claire and Daniel coordinated with law enforcement while relatives fielded phone calls and maintained lists of searched areas, tips received, and people interviewed. The dining room table disappeared beneath maps marked with colored pins, each representing a sighting or lead that needed follow-up. An FBI child abduction specialist arrived on the third day, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, establishing protocols for interstate alerts and coordinating with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards, Mara's face reproduced thousands of times, the red shoes mentioned prominently in the description alongside her height, weight, and distinguishing features. A local marshal named Eugene Briggs took personal interest in the case, spending off-duty hours reviewing traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, squinting at screens until his eyes burned. He found a partial license plate on a dark sedan captured 2 blocks from the school at 3:17, and for 48 hours the investigation surged with renewed focus and energy. Officers tracked the vehicle to a rental agency in Des Moines, but the renter had returned it the next day and seemed to disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. The lead collapsed under scrutiny. Credit card records showed the renter at a conference in Minneapolis during the precise abduction window, a dozen witnesses confirming his presence in meetings throughout that afternoon. The case stalled, momentum bleeding away like air from a punctured tire. Weeks became months in the grinding way that time moves when waiting for news that never comes. Halloween arrived, and Claire left the porch light off, unable to face costumed children and their innocent joy. Thanksgiving dinner was a silent affair. Mara's chair left empty at Daniel's insistence, a place setting laid that no one could bring themselves to remove. Claire stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch, waking to check her phone for messages that never came, for calls from investigators reporting breakthroughs that remained perpetually out of reach. Daniel threw himself into organizing volunteer searches every weekend, his hands cracked and bleeding from moving brush and debris along riverbanks and forest edges, searching places that had already been searched multiple times. Their marriage bent under the weight of shared trauma, conversations reduced to logistics, and silences heavy with blame neither could articulate, but both felt pressing down. The media attention cycled predictably. Intense coverage in the first 2 weeks. Camera crews parked outside their house, then sporadic updates on anniversaries and slow news days when producers needed emotional content. By the following spring, most neighbors had removed their yellow ribbons from trees and mailboxes. The Hollises received sympathy cards and casseroles that accumulated in the freezer, gestures of care that felt increasingly performative as time stretched forward without answers, without closure, without any sense of progress or direction. The investigation never officially closed, but entered what detectives called a maintenance phase, a bureaucratic term for cases that fade from active status into periodic review. Every 6 months, a detective pulled the file, reviewing it for new forensic techniques or database matches that might crack it open. Age progression software generated images of what Mara might look like at 10, at 13, at 16, at 20. Each iteration feeling both necessary and surreal, a ghost aging in pixels. Claire kept a binder of these projections, studying them late at night until the faces blurred together into a composite that was neither her daughter nor a stranger. The family participated in awareness campaigns, their story woven into statistics about child abduction and recovery rates presented at conferences and training seminars. Daniel testified before state legislators advocating for improved Amber Alert systems and better interagency communication, channeling his helplessness into action. Claire volunteered with support groups for families of missing children, finding solace in shared grief, but never quite believing her daughter would remain merely a statistic forever. The red shoes remained in an evidence locker at the police station, catalogued and preserved in a sealed plastic bag, their laces still tied in the hurried double knot of an 8-year-old running late for the school bus. Years accumulated like sediment, each one adding another layer of distance and resignation. The house felt too large and too full simultaneously, every room haunted by the child who had once filled it with noise and motion and the particular chaos of childhood. Claire kept Mara's bedroom exactly as it had been, the bedspread still rumpled from the last morning she slept there, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, gathering dust despite weekly cleanings. Daniel eventually moved to the guest room, unable to share a bed with someone whose grief mirrored his own too perfectly, reflecting back the pain neither could escape. They spoke less as the years passed, communicated through notes left on the kitchen counter about groceries needed and bills to pay. When Claire's mother suggested selling the house and starting fresh elsewhere, perhaps in a different state where memories wouldn't ambush them at every corner, Claire's response was immediate and absolute. Moving meant abandoning the last place Mara knew as home, erasing the possibility she might somehow find her way back to the blue shutters and oak tree on the corner. The compromise was silence on the subject, an unspoken agreement to endure whatever needed enduring. September 27th arrived each year with ritualistic weight, marking time in a way that felt both necessary and unbearable. The Hollises attended a small memorial gathering at the park where Mara used to play, other families of missing children joining in solidarity, a community bound by absence, candles flickered in paper cups, names read aloud into the evening air, moments of silence observed with heads bowed. Local news stations occasionally sent reporters, particularly on milestone anniversaries, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, interviews that Claire gave out of duty rather than hope, her responses practiced and hollow. The detective assigned to the case changed 3 times over 2 decades, each promising continued diligence, each inheriting a file that grew thicker without resolution, filled with dead ends and exhausted leads. DNA samples remained in databases, flagged for automatic comparison against unidentified remains and hospital intakes across the country. Technology improved steadily. Databases expanded and became interconnected. Cross-referencing became more sophisticated. Facial recognition software evolved beyond early limitations, but Mara remained conspicuously absent from all systems, a name without a match, a question without an answer. In March 2021, 21 years and 6 months after Mara's disappearance, a hospital in Davenport admitted a woman found disoriented and wandering outside a truck stop at dawn. She appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s, wore no identification, carried no personal belongings, and could not provide her name, address, or any verifiable biographical information. Emergency room staff labeled her Jane Doe for intake purposes, conducting standard medical evaluations, while social workers attempted to trace missing person reports that might match her description. She was physically healthy, but demonstrated signs of acute psychological distress, difficulty making eye contact, reluctance to answer questions, episodes of dissociation where she seemed to retreat entirely into herself. Routine protocol required DNA collection for cross-referencing with state and federal databases, a standard procedure for unidentified individuals seeking medical care. The sample was processed through Iowa's Missing Persons Registry first, then expanded to national systems including CODIS and NAMUS. On the third day of Jane Doe's hospitalization, a lab technician in Des Moines received an automated alert on her screen. The DNA profile matched a sample from a 21-year-old cold case out of Cedar Falls. The match probability exceeded 99.99%, a statistical certainty that allowed no room for error. The technician triple-checked the results, comparing markers and verifying sample integrity before forwarding them to law enforcement, her hands trembling slightly as she typed the notification email that would change multiple lives. Detective Sarah Ortiz, who had inherited the Hollis case file 4 years earlier when she transferred to the cold case unit, received the alert at her desk on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. She read it twice, then a third time, her heart rate accelerating as the implications registered. She pulled the physical file from storage, a banker's box containing 2 decades of documentation, comparing case notes with the hospital report from Davenport. The age was right. Jane Doe appeared consistent with someone approximately 29 or 30 years old. The physical description matched reasonably well, allowing for maturation and environmental factors. The DNA was incontrovertible, the science absolute. Ortiz contacted the hospital immediately, requesting they maintain Jane Doe's privacy and security while arrangements were made for next steps. Then she made the call she had never expected to place in her career, one that happened so rarely it felt almost mythical. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice tired and flat with the exhaustion of 2 decades of disappointment. Ortiz chose her words carefully, explaining there had been a significant development in Mara's case, that they needed to meet in person as soon as possible. Claire's silence stretched long enough that Ortiz thought the connection had dropped, and then came a single word, barely audible and heavy with every possible emotion. When? No. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Cedar Falls police station, neutral territory designed for difficult conversations that required privacy and professional support. Claire and Daniel sat across from Detective Ortiz and a victim advocate, their faces cautious and aged by decades of disappointment and grief that had carved deep lines. Ortiz explained the DNA match in clear terms, the hospital circumstances, the woman's apparent memory gaps and psychological state. She used the phrase probable identification rather than definitive confirmation, tempering expectations while acknowledging the overwhelming evidence. Claire's hands were folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles whitened to bone, and her breathing came in shallow, controlled bursts. Daniel asked practical questions about verification procedures and next steps, his voice steady but strained with the effort of maintaining composure. The reunion would need to be managed carefully, Ortiz explained, with therapeutic oversight. Jane Doe, possibly Mara, probably Mara, showed signs of dissociative memory patterns and trauma responses, responding to some prompts but unable to recall biographical details or personal history. A therapist specializing in trauma and identity would facilitate the initial meeting, establishing safety and consent protocols that protected everyone involved. Claire nodded mechanically, processing information that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable, the answer to 21 years of prayer that arrived in a form she had never imagined. The first meeting occurred in a private room at the Davenport Hospital 4 days later, time needed for therapeutic preparation and coordination. Jane Doe sat in a chair by the window, afternoon sunlight illuminating her profile and casting shadows across features that carried recognizable architecture. She had brown hair, lighter than Mara's had been, but within the range of natural variation and sun exposure, and her features carried the bone structure and proportions of the child Claire had known, matured into adult dimensions. A therapist named Dr. Kenji Yamamoto sat nearby, ready to intervene if distress escalated beyond manageable levels. Claire entered slowly, Daniel a step behind, both moving as if through water, time slowing to individual frames. Jane Doe turned toward them, her expression neutral and searching, studying their faces with the intensity of someone trying to decode a foreign language, but no spark of recognition was immediately visible. The therapist invited Claire to sit in the chair positioned at a comfortable distance, suggesting she begin with simple, factual statements rather than questions that might feel coercive or demanding. Claire sat, her throat tight with emotion she struggled to contain, and said the only thing that felt true and manageable. "My name is Claire. This is Daniel. We think you might be our daughter Mara." Jane Doe's eyes remained steady, studying Claire's face as if trying to read meaning in features and expressions, searching for something she could not quite name or access. Over the following hour, small exchanges occurred in carefully moderated increments. Dr. Yamamoto guided the conversation through sensory memories and environmental details, rather than direct recall of events or relationships, a technique designed to bypass defensive psychological barriers. Claire described the house with its blue shutters and white trim, the oak tree on the corner that dropped acorns every fall, the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings when Daniel cooked breakfast for the family. Jane Doe listened without visible emotion, occasionally nodding, sometimes closing her eyes as if trying to visualize what was being described or access buried memory fragments. When Claire mentioned the red canvas sneakers with white rubber soles and double-knotted laces, something shifted in Jane Doe's posture and expression. Her hands moved to her lap, fingers tracing an invisible pattern in the air, and she spoke for the first time in more than a whisper. "Shoes make noise on wet ground. Squeaking." The words were quiet and disconnected from broader context, but specific in their sensory detail, a fragment floating to the surface. Claire's breath caught audibly, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Yamamoto asked gentle follow-up questions, but Jane Doe could not expand further, the memory fragment floating alone in an otherwise blank landscape, an island without connections to surrounding territory. The red shoes became the bridge across 21 years of absence, with permission from evidence management and therapeutic oversight emphasizing the potential for both breakthrough and re-traumatization. The actual shoes were brought to a subsequent session 3 days later. They sat on the table between Jane Doe and Claire, faded to a dusty pink but recognizable, the canvas creased with wear, the laces still double-knotted with the peculiar twist Mara had favored. Jane Doe stared at them for a long time without speaking, her breathing changing pattern becoming shallow and rapid. Dr. Yamamoto monitored closely for signs of acute distress or dissociative episodes. Jane Doe reached toward the shoes slowly, her fingers hovering inches above them without making contact, trembling slightly. Then she withdrew her hand, wrapping her arms around herself in a self-protective gesture, and began describing sensations in a flat monotone. Rain against glass. A radio playing low with voices indistinct. The feeling of being very still, for a long time in a small space, the smell of something floral and chemical like cleaning products. The memories were fragmentary and dissociated, presented without emotional connection or narrative coherence, as if narrating someone else's experience from a great distance. Claire listened, tears streaming silently, recognizing the symptoms of profound psychological survival mechanisms shaped by extended trauma. Whatever Mara had endured in 21 years had required her to sever the connections between self and memory, identity and history, in order to psychologically survive circumstances that would otherwise have been unbearable. The investigation into how Mara had disappeared and where she had been accelerated rapidly with resources and urgency. Jane Doe, gradually accepting the name Mara with therapeutic support over subsequent weeks, underwent extensive interviews with trained forensic specialists who understood the delicate balance between gathering information for justice and re-traumatizing survivors whose psychological stability remained fragile. Over weeks and months, a fragmented narrative emerged through careful questioning and patient reconstruction. She remembered living in multiple locations across several states, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, always with the same woman who called herself different names depending on where they were living: Aunt Helen, Aunt Margaret, Aunt Ruth, Aunt Patricia. The woman had enrolled her in various schools under fabricated identities with minimal documentation, keeping moves frequent enough to avoid scrutiny and institutional memory. She remembered being told repeatedly that her real parents had died in an accident, that she was now in protective custody of a relative, that speaking to strangers or authorities about her situation would result in terrible consequences she could not fully articulate but deeply feared. She remembered small kindnesses, books to read, occasional trips to parks where she could swing and feel briefly normal, a stuffed bear she was allowed to keep, and long stretches of isolation in apartments where curtains remained drawn and she was instructed to stay quiet when neighbors were nearby. She could not remember any overt physical abuse, but described a pervasive atmosphere of control and psychological surveillance that had taught her compliance as the only viable survival mechanism, a learned helplessness that shaped decades of her development. Investigators traced the deceased woman through property records, school enrollment archives, and utility bills cross-referenced across multiple jurisdictions. She had died in late February 2020 from complications of untreated diabetes, leaving no next of kin and minimal estate to settle. Forensic accountants and profilers pieced together her life from fragments. A woman named Patricia Elaine Drummond, age 63 at death, with a history of transient employment in retail and clerical positions, no criminal record, and a notably isolated existence. Her background revealed a daughter who had died of leukemia at age 7 in 1993, and psychological profiles suggested Drummond had suffered severe, unresolved grief, leading to delusional beliefs about replacement and second chances to be the mother she felt she had failed to be. Investigators theorized she had likely observed Mara at or near the school over multiple days, identified her as matching her deceased daughter's age and general appearance, and acted on impulse amplified by years of untreated mental illness and cognitive distortion. The abduction had not been premeditated in the sense of careful planning, nor part of any trafficking network, but rather the tragic action of a profoundly disturbed individual who convinced herself through layers of delusion that she was saving rather than stealing a child, rescuing rather than destroying a family. The legal aftermath was complicated by Drummond's death and the absence of any living co-conspirators. There could be no prosecution, no courtroom accountability, no justice in the traditional sense, only the slow work of documentation and administrative closure. The case prompted immediate reviews of school enrollment verification systems and inter-district communication protocols across Iowa and surrounding states. Legislators introduced bills requiring more robust identity verification for school registrations, mandatory reporting training for educators to recognize potential trafficking or custodial irregularities, and better integration between child welfare databases and law enforcement missing person systems. Mara's story became evidence in committee hearings and policy debates, though her privacy was fiercely protected through sealed testimony and restricted media access. She did not testify publicly, and current photographs were kept from media circulation. The focus shifted deliberately to systemic reform rather than individual narrative exploitation, using her experience to prevent future cases while allowing her the space to heal privately away from public scrutiny and the inevitable voyeurism such cases attract. Reintegration proved far more complex than the initial reunion, a process measured in years rather than weeks or months. Mara moved into a transitional living facility that specialized in trauma recovery and identity reconstruction. Not ready for the intensity of immediate family cohabitation or the emotional demands of constant interaction. Therapy occurred daily initially, then scaled to several times weekly, addressing dissociative patterns, re-establishing baseline trust in relationships and institutions, and slowly reconstructing identity outside of survival mode and learned compliance. She had completed high school equivalency testing under a false name in Kansas at age 19, had worked occasional retail and food service jobs under forged documentation, had lived a shadow existence that left minimal documentary footprint or verifiable history. Now she needed to reclaim legal identity through complex bureaucratic processes, establish credit history from nothing, navigate social services and benefit systems, obtain proper identification documents, and learn how to be a person with a verifiable past and a name that matched records. Claire and Daniel attended family therapy sessions weekly, processing their own grief and trauma responses while learning how to support a daughter who bore little psychological resemblance to the child they had lost, who carried trauma responses and coping mechanisms that often created distance rather than intimacy. The relationship rebuilt slowly, in careful increments measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in sustained presence, gradual trust, and the accumulation of small positive interactions that could begin to outweigh years of absence. The red shoes remained important throughout the recovery process, serving functions both practical and symbolic. Mara kept them in her room at the transitional facility, displayed on a shelf where she could see them daily, a tangible anchor to the self that had existed before disappearance and the family that had never stopped searching. Dr. Yamamoto explained they served as a transitional object in therapeutic terms, bridging fragmented identity states and grounding her in continuity despite profound memory gaps and psychological disruption. Over months and years, more fragments surfaced through various therapeutic modalities, not complete narratives with clear chronology, but sensory impressions and emotional echoes that connected past and present. She remembered the hopscotch game on the sidewalk that last morning, Emma's distinctive laugh that carried across the street, the particular smell of her mother's perfume that mixed with coffee in the car. She remembered feeling safe and loved in the house with blue shutters, remembered the pattern of the oak tree's shadow across her bedroom window on summer evenings. The memories did not erase or diminish the years lost, but coexisted with them in complex psychological space, dual timelines occupying the same person, both equally real and equally part of who she had become. 2 years after her return and identification, Mara enrolled in community college courses, beginning with introductory psychology and gradually building toward a focus on trauma and memory systems. She found purpose and meaning in understanding her own experience through academic frameworks and scientific research, translating survival into knowledge that could potentially help others. The work was difficult, often triggering unexpected emotional responses when course material intersected with personal experience, but her therapists supported the pursuit as part of healthy identity reconstruction. Claire and Daniel attended her graduation ceremony when she completed her associate degree. Pride mingled with persistent grief for all the milestones missed: proms and driver's licenses, first jobs and college applications, all the ordinary markers of growing up that had been stolen. The relationship between them was different than it would have been without 2 decades of interruption, shaped irrevocably by loss and adaptation, marked by boundaries that felt strange but necessary. But it was real and growing, authentic in its imperfection. Mara began volunteering with organizations supporting long-term missing person cases, offering perspective and insight only a survivor could provide, advocating for patient and survivor-centered approaches to reunification that prioritized psychological safety over rushed emotional reconciliations designed for media narratives. 4 years after her return, Mara spoke publicly for the first time at a professional conference for law enforcement and victim advocates, sharing her experience with the goal of improving protocols and training. She spoke about the importance of maintaining DNA databases indefinitely, the need for trauma-informed interview techniques that understand dissociation and memory fragmentation, and the recognition that survivors might not immediately present with clear memories or emotional responses that match cultural expectations of reunion scenes. Her testimony was measured and clinical, deliberately avoiding sensationalism, focusing on practical lessons that could protect future victims and improve outcomes. The presentation received standing ovation from professionals who understood its significance, and multiple jurisdictions updated their protocols based on her recommendations. She declined media interviews, maintaining boundaries around privacy and refusing to become a public face or symbol, instead channeling energy into substantive policy work and therapeutic support for other survivors. The Hollis case became a touchstone in professional discussions about missing children and long-term recoveries, cited in training materials and academic papers. It demonstrated both the critical importance of maintaining hope and systematic searching across decades, and the profound complexity of resolution that defies simplistic narratives. The case showed that return does not equal instant healing, that families reunited after such intervals face challenges as significant as the search itself, requiring different but equally intensive support. Training programs for law enforcement incorporated specific lessons from the investigation, the value of persistent DNA database maintenance and regular cross-referencing, the need for trauma-informed interview techniques that avoid re-traumatization, the recognition that memory works differently under extended trauma conditions. The case also highlighted significant gaps in educational oversight and enrollment verification, demonstrating the relative ease with which someone could move a child through systems ostensibly designed to protect, but lacking sufficient verification mechanisms or inter-district communication. Claire established a non-profit foundation in Mara's name 3 years after the reunion, focused on supporting families of long-term missing children and funding research into memory recovery and trauma treatment approaches. The foundation provided grants for age progression imaging, maintained awareness campaigns, offered counseling services to families navigating ambiguous loss, and advocated for policy reforms at state and federal levels. The foundation's logo featured a simple outline of red shoes, transformed from evidence into symbol of hope and persistence. Daniel returned to advocacy work with renewed energy and purpose, channeling decades of helplessness into actionable policy changes, testifying before legislative committees and consulting with law enforcement agencies developing protocols. The marriage survived against significant odds, though profoundly transformed by shared trauma, both partners acknowledging the fractures and choosing daily to bridge them through deliberate effort and mutual commitment. The house with blue shutters remained their home, now hosting occasional gatherings of other families navigating similar journeys. The dining room table cleared of investigation maps and filled instead with coffee cups and shared stories. The community of loss finding solace in collective understanding. Mara continues her work in trauma psychology, now pursuing graduate studies with specialized focus on dissociative disorders and identity reconstruction following prolonged captivity. She maintains relationships with both her biological family and a chosen community of survivors and advocates who understand her experience in ways others cannot. The red shoes sit on a shelf in her apartment, rarely worn, given their fragility and evidentiary history, but always visible, reminding her that some threads, however frayed by time and circumstance, are never completely severed. She has learned to live with profound ambiguity, accepting that some memories may never fully return, while celebrating the identity she has actively and deliberately rebuilt through years of therapeutic work. Her story does not offer simple resolution or comfortable closure of the type preferred in media narratives, but it demonstrates the extraordinary resilience of human capacity for adaptation and the profound importance of systems and institutions that refuse to forget, that maintain hope as active practice rather than passive wish, that continue searching even when statistics suggest futility. If you or someone you know is navigating the aftermath of a long-term missing person case, resources exist specifically designed to help. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains comprehensive databases and offers support services for families at every stage of searching and recovery. Trauma-informed therapy through organizations specializing in complex PTSD and dissociative disorders can provide crucial guidance for survivors and reunited families. Legal aid societies help survivors reclaim documentation and legal identity through bureaucratic processes. Support groups and communities of those who have walked similar paths offer understanding that transcends professional expertise, providing emotional support through shared experience. Mara's return after 21 years reminds us that time does not erase obligation or diminish the value of continued effort, that every case deserves sustained attention regardless of how many years pass, and that coming home is not an ending but the beginning of a different and equally demanding journey that requires patience, resources, and unwavering commitment from everyone involved.